The morning air was cool and still when he stepped out of his car and looked around the quiet street. He had driven there with a simple plan in mind. He wanted to walk around the property he had bought only a few weeks earlier. Look at the boundaries, check the old fence, get a feel of the place. It was a peaceful task, something he hoped would bring him a sense of pride and comfort. The kind of moment where a person just stands still for a bit, taking in the fact that they worked hard for something real. But almost as soon as he closed his door and took a few steps forward, he felt a shift in the air that told him this was not going to be a simple visit. From the corner of the property, a group of people stood watching him closely. He didn't know any of them, but their stares were sharp enough to feel. At first, he didn't think much of it. People stare sometimes, especially when someone new walks into a place they don't expect. He kept walking, trying to mind his own business, but the feeling of being watched grew heavier. He tried to brush it off, telling himself they would probably just go back to whatever they were doing. But the group didn't go anywhere. He could hear their quiet murmurs from where he stood, and soon their quiet talk turned into steps approaching him. He turned slightly, and one of them, a tall man with a heavy expression, walked straight toward him without hesitation. The others followed close behind, not hiding the fact that they were there to confront him. He tried to remain calm, even polite. It wasn't unusual for neighbors to wonder who a new face was, and he hoped the encounter would be quick and simple. But the tall man's eyes were already set in suspicion. "What are you doing here?" the man said, not in a friendly tone, but in a demanding way, as if the land belonged to him. For a second, he considered choosing his words carefully. He didn't want trouble. He only wanted to walk around the place he legally owned. He smiled lightly and said, just looking around. The man's expression didn't soften at all. In fact, the suspicion grew sharper. "Looking around for what? You're not supposed to be here." He paused, surprised by how quickly the conversation had turned tense. He wasn't expecting a warm welcome, but he definitely wasn't expecting hostility. He took a gentle breath and said, "I think there's been a misunderstanding." But the man didn't let him finish. "Misunderstanding? This is private property. You can't just walk around here." The others behind him nodded in agreement, some folding their arms, some staring as if waiting for him to run, as though he were doing something wrong. He felt a wave of frustration, but stayed calm. He wasn't there to fight with anyone. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said. "I just came to see the place." The tall man raised an eyebrow. "Why? What business do you have here?" The tone made it clear that the man wasn't asking out of curiosity. He was accusing him, judging him. Assuming the worst, he tried again to keep the peace. "This land," he began, but once again he was cut off. "Don't lie," one of the women in the group snapped. "We've lived here for years. We don't know you. No one told us anything about someone new coming. So don't make up stories." He slowly closed his mouth and looked at all of them, realizing they had already decided who he was before he even spoke. They didn't know anything about him, but they treated him like someone suspicious, someone out of place. He didn't want to argue. He didn't want to raise his voice or get into a heated exchange. He had come with a calm heart, and he wanted to keep it that way. But their energy was anything but calm. "I'm telling you the truth," he said softly. "I have a reason to be here." The tall man took a step closer, narrowing the distance. "Then explain yourself, because right now it looks like you're trespassing." He felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Even though he knew he had every right to be there, he could feel the strong wall of mistrust surrounding him. He wondered what made them so quick to assume he was up to no good. Maybe they had issues with strangers. Maybe they had problems before. Or maybe they were just used to controlling who stepped onto the land. "I don't owe you an explanation," he finally said. Not in a harsh way, but in a firm, respectful tone. "But I'm not doing anything wrong." The man didn't like that answer at all. His jaw tightened, and one of the men behind him said loudly, "Call the cops. Let them handle this." He blinked in disbelief. "There's no need for that." The group had already decided. One of them pulled out a phone, tapping the screen quickly. "We'll see who you really are," the woman said, giving him a cold look. He stood there quietly, feeling the strange mix of annoyance and disappointment. He couldn't help but wonder how things could go wrong so quickly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't insult anyone. He didn't cross any boundaries. Yet here he was, being treated like a criminal on the very land he had signed papers for. He looked at the group. They looked back with the same level of distrust they had from the beginning. He could see it in their eyes. They were convinced they were in the right. They didn't pause to think they might be wrong. A few minutes passed. The atmosphere grew heavier with each passing second. The woman who made the call kept glancing at him, tapping her foot impatiently as if waiting for justice to arrive and remove him from the land. The tall man kept his arms crossed, shoulders stiff. Acting like he was guarding something valuable, he stepped aside a little, giving himself some space, and looked over the fence line. The yard wasn't large, but it had old charm. The kind of charm he saw when he first came across the listing. The trees were tall, gently swaying in the breeze. The grass needed work, but it wasn't anything he couldn't handle. He imagined planting new flowers, repainting the fence, maybe adding some benches. He already had plans forming in his mind, but all of that felt distant now as he waited for police to arrive over something that could have been solved with a calm conversation. A car slowly approached the street, then another. He knew instantly who it was. The group's expressions shifted. Some looked proud as if they had done something responsible. Others appeared eager to see what would happen next. For a moment, he closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He wasn't scared of anything. He wasn't worried about what the police would say. He had nothing to hide. He just felt drained, tired of the unfairness of the situation. But he reminded himself that staying calm was the best choice. The cars stopped. The officers stepped out, not rushing, not alarmed. They walked with routine steps, looking around before approaching the group. The tall man quickly stepped forward, pointing toward him as if presenting evidence. "That's him," the man said. "He's been wandering around where he shouldn't." The officers turned their eyes to him. Their expressions were neutral, their posture professional. One of them approached him slowly and asked, "Sir, what seems to be going on today?" He lifted his head and offered a polite nod. "I'm just here to look at this place. I didn't mean to cause any issues." The officer's voice remained even. "They're saying you're trespassing." He expected that. He glanced briefly at the group, then back at the officer. "I understand what they're saying," he replied quietly. "But I think we're dealing with a misunderstanding." The officer nodded slightly, not making any quick assumptions. "All right. Can you tell me why you're here?" Before he could answer, one of the residents interrupted loudly, "Because he's lying. He has no reason to be here." He looked at the officer again, and this time the officer raised his hand toward the group to calm them down. "Let him speak," the officer said. He appreciated that small gesture. Finally, someone was giving him space to talk. "I came because I needed to see the place I purchased," he said simply. The officer blinked, as if making sure he heard correctly. "You purchased it?" He nodded. "Yes." The group behind him erupted into disbelieving murmurs. But the officer stayed calm. "Do you have any documents with you?" the officer asked. He took a small breath and touched the folder he kept tucked safely inside his bag. "I do," he said softly. "But if you don't mind, I'd like to explain it properly." The officer gave a small nod, signaling that he could continue. And at that moment, he realized this was only the beginning. The truth would come out soon. The tension, the assumptions, the anger, all of it would make sense once the real story came to light. But for now, he stood there quietly, waiting for the moment he would show the truth that none of them expected. The misunderstanding had turned into confrontation. The confrontation had turned into a call to the police. And now, the police were here, ready to sort out the truth. And he knew his next words and the papers he carried would change everything. The officer stood between him and the group, trying to keep the situation calm while they figured out what was actually happening. He could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on him, but he stayed steady. He knew the truth would come out soon. He had nothing to fear. What bothered him wasn't the police being there, was the way the whole thing had happened. All he did was show up at land he owned, and somehow that became a problem. One of the officers, the one who had spoken to him earlier, took a small step closer. His voice was calm and respectful. "All right, sir," he said. "You mentioned earlier that you have documents with you. If you don't mind, we'd like to take a look so we can understand the situation clearly." He gave a small nod. "Of course," he said softly. He didn't rush. He didn't make any defensive movements. Simply reached down, opened the side of his bag, and pulled out the folder he always kept prepared. He wasn't expecting to use it today, but something told him to bring it anyway. Maybe he knew deep down that people wouldn't easily believe him. The group behind him stared at the folder as if it were something suspicious, something dangerous. They leaned forward, waiting to judge whatever he pulled out. They had already made up a story in their heads, and they were ready to stick to it no matter how wrong it was. He handed the folder to the officer. "Everything is inside," he said quietly. The officer opened it carefully. The papers inside were neatly arranged, not a single corner bent. He had taken care of them the moment he got them. There were signatures, stamps, dates, everything needed to prove ownership. The officer scanned through the pages slowly. Didn't rush, didn't skim. He took his time, reading line by line. The more he read, the more his expression shifted. Not in shock, not in disbelief, but in understanding. The tall man from the group took a step forward, impatience in every part of his body. "What is it?" he asked. "What's he showing you?" The officer didn't answer right away. He kept reading, but his silence alone made the group restless. Some of them exchanged nervous glances. Others looked annoyed, as if they were already regretting making the call. One of the women crossed her arms tightly. "Those papers can't be real," she muttered. "We would have known if someone else bought this land. Someone would have told us." But the officer finally looked up. "These are official documents," he said, his tone steady. "They show legal transfer of ownership. Everything seems valid so far." The group froze. He didn't smile, didn't gloat. He simply stood there, calm, as he had been from the beginning. Wanted peace, not victory. The tall man shook his head slightly, as if trying to process the officer's words. "You're saying he's the owner?" The officer glanced at the papers again. "That's what these documents indicate." The other officer, who had stayed silent until then, stepped closer and looked at the folder as well. She nodded slowly. "These look legitimate," she said. He wasn't surprised. Knew the papers were real. Seeing the officers confirm it made the air shift. The group's confidence cracked a little. Still, disbelief clung to some of them. "Let me see those," the tall man demanded, taking a step closer. The officer held up his hand calmly. "Sir, we're handling this. Please step back." The man clenched his jaw, but obeyed. Not because he agreed, but because the authorities standing in front of him left no room for argument. The officer turned back to him. "Can you explain how long you've owned the land?" He nodded. "A few weeks now," he said. "The previous owner and I finalized everything recently. I came today just to look around and plan some repairs." He said it with such natural honesty that even the officers could feel it. The officer nodded. "That lines up with what I'm seeing here." Behind them, the whispers began. "How could we not know? It doesn't make sense. No one told us anything." He felt a small ache in his chest. Not anger, just disappointment. Everything they said now could have been said earlier if they had given him a chance to speak. Instead, they had jumped straight to assumptions. One of the women stepped forward hesitantly. "Why didn't you say you owned the place?" He looked at her calmly. "I tried," he said softly. "But no one let me finish a sentence." She opened her mouth but didn't know what to say. The tall man wasn't ready to accept anything yet. His pride stood tall even when he was proven wrong. "This doesn't add up," he said stubbornly. "Why would someone like him buy property here? Who even sells land without telling us?" The officer gave him a firm look. "Sir, ownership doesn't need approval from neighbors. The previous owner had every right to sell it." The tall man's face tightened, but he didn't have an answer. The other officer closed the folder and handed it back to him with a respectful nod. "Thank you," she said. "Everything checks out." He accepted the folder quietly, placing it back inside his bag. The first officer turned toward the group. "There's been a misunderstanding," he said clearly. "This man is not trespassing. He's the legal owner of this land." The group didn't know where to look. Some stared at the ground. Some looked away entirely. Some couldn't meet his eyes. The tall man ran a hand over his face, frustrated not because he was right, but because he had been wrong. The officer continued, his tone still calm but firm. Next time, please try to ask questions before making assumptions. This situation could have been handled peacefully without police involvement. It was a gentle scolding, but it hit the group harder than anything he could have said. He appreciated the officer's fairness. They hadn't treated him like a threat. They hadn't taken sides too early. They stayed professional, and that meant something. When the officers were satisfied that the situation had calmed down, they stepped back. "Is everyone okay now?" the first officer asked. He nodded. "I'm fine." The group muttered a few words of agreement, though none of them sounded confident. Before leaving, the officer gave him a small, respectful nod. "If you need anything or run into any issues again, feel free to call," he said. "Thank you," he replied quietly. The officers walked to their car, speaking softly to each other. When they drove away, silence settled over the street. It wasn't peaceful silence. It was the kind that sits heavy in the air, reminding everyone of what just happened. He stood there for a moment, letting the quiet wash over him. He wasn't angry. He wasn't bothered. He had dealt with much bigger things in life. But he couldn't ignore the way the group stared at him now, more confused than hostile. One of the women finally stepped forward. Her voice was softer, a little embarrassed. "We didn't know," she said. "That's why we reacted the way we did." He met her eyes calmly. "I understand," he said. But he didn't add anything more. He didn't want to make them feel worse, but he also didn't want to excuse their behavior. Another man from the group cleared his throat. "If we had known you were the owner, we wouldn't have acted like that." He nodded slightly. "Maybe next time, just try asking. Saves everyone a lot of trouble." They nodded in agreement. Their shoulders were no longer tense. Their voices were no longer sharp. They looked like people who finally understood something important. He turned back toward the land, looking over it slowly. The place felt different now, not because the land had changed, but because the truth was finally out. He walked a few steps forward. The group didn't try to stop him this time. They simply watched, unsure if they should say anything else. Some of them looked like they wanted to apologize more but didn't know how. He didn't expect them to. He wasn't here to hold grudges. He just wanted to look around, make plans, imagine what this land would become under his care. And now, finally, he could. He walked along the fence, running his hand lightly across the worn wood. The breeze brushed against him, carrying the quiet sounds of the neighborhood. For the first time since he arrived, he felt a sense of belonging, not because the group accepted him, but because the truth had secured his place. Behind him, the group slowly began to disperse. Some walked away quietly. Some whispered to each other. Some stayed behind a little longer, watching him with more curiosity than suspicion. He didn't mind. At least the hostility was gone. He stood at the center of the land and took a slow breath, letting the moment settle inside him. It faced their doubts, their accusations, their quick judgment, but his truth had stood firm. It wasn't a loud victory, wasn't something he wanted to brag about. It was simply clarity, and clarity was enough. He stayed a little longer, planning, imagining, building ideas in his head. He knew this land would someday reflect his effort, his patience, and his quiet strength. As he looked around, he knew one thing clearly. This was only the beginning. There was still more to happen, more to uncover, more to say. And even though the morning had started with tension and suspicion, it would end with truth, and truth always found its way through. He stayed on the land for a while after the crowd slowly walked away, enjoying the quiet that finally settled in the air. The earlier tension had faded, leaving behind a stillness he much preferred. He took a slow walk toward the back of the property, trying to imagine what the place could become in the next few months. He had plans, ideas he had waited years to finally bring to life. But even as he tried to focus on those thoughts, he couldn't completely ignore the strange feeling left from the morning's events. A part of him wanted to understand what had made the neighbors react the way they did. Was it fear? Was it suspicion? Or was it simply the fact that they were used to feeling like they controlled everything around them? He wasn't sure, but he knew the story wasn't over yet. People didn't change their minds in one moment, especially when they were forced to accept something they didn't expect. He stood under one of the big trees on the edge of the property, listening to the soft rustling of the leaves above him. It was peaceful, calming, a reminder that the land itself had done nothing wrong. The situation had come from misunderstandings and assumptions, not reality. A couple of minutes passed before he heard footsteps approaching again. They weren't rushed, and they weren't angry, or hesitant, almost careful. He turned slightly and saw one of the older men from the group walking toward him. The man looked calmer now, though his face carried a mix of curiosity and leftover embarrassment. "Mind if I speak with you for a moment?" the man asked, his voice quieter than before. He nodded. "Sure." The older man stopped a few steps away, as if unsure how close he should stand. He cleared his throat softly. "I just wanted to say that earlier. Things got out of hand." He stayed silent, letting the man continue. "We didn't know who you were," the man said. "And around here, when someone new shows up without warning, folks get nervous." He looked at him with calm eyes. "I understand. But still, calling the police before asking a simple question felt unnecessary." The man sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "You're right. It wasn't the best way to handle things." There was a short pause. The man looked up again. "We heard rumors a while back that the previous owner wasn't planning to sell. So when you said you owned the place, it didn't make sense to us. That explained at least a part of the confusion." "The truth is simple," he said quietly. "The owner decided to sell. I made an offer, and everything was processed legally." The older man nodded slowly. "I guess we were left out of the loop." There was no anger in his voice now, just honesty. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said. "I just want to improve the land, fix what needs fixing, and make it a place I can feel proud of." The man's expression softened. "That's fair," he said, "and, well, I'm sorry for how we reacted. Some of the others may never admit it, but we were wrong." He gave a slight, understanding smile. "Apology accepted." The man nodded once more before heading back toward the street. His steps were slower, but lighter. One conversation didn't solve everything, but it was a start. When the man was gone, he continued walking, exploring each corner of the land. Every step he took made the place feel more familiar. The small patches of wild grass, the sun-worn fence, the uneven ground, these details didn't bother him. He had always believed that every good thing started in a rough, imperfect place. While he was examining the old shed near the back, he heard voices again. He wondered if more neighbors were coming to confront him, but the tone of the voices didn't sound tense. They sounded curious. He walked around the corner of the shed and saw two younger people standing near the edge of the property. They weren't part of the group that had yelled at him earlier. They looked more open-minded, interested, rather than suspicious. One of them raised a hand in a small greeting. "Hi," the person said. "We didn't want to bother you earlier. Things were kind of intense." "I bet yes. We just wanted to say welcome," the other said. "We heard you were the new owner." Her tone was warm and genuine, a refreshing contrast from what he had dealt with earlier. "Thank you," he said softly. They stepped a bit closer, still keeping a comfortable distance. "Do you plan to build something here?" one of them asked. "I'm not sure yet," he replied. "I want to fix the place first. Then I'll decide what to do next." "That's nice. This area could use some care," the person said, glancing around. He appreciated their friendliness. It helped balance out the rough start to the day. They chatted for a few minutes about the land, the neighborhood, and small things like weather and local shops. For the first time since he arrived that morning, he felt like he was having a normal conversation. Eventually, they waved goodbye and walked off. He watched them go with a soft smile. It reminded him that not everyone here was quick to judge. Some people simply needed a chance to see who he was before forming an opinion. The sun climbed higher in the sky, warming the air. He decided to take a break and sat down on an old wooden bench near the tree. It was a bit worn, but still sturdy. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sunlight fall across his face. But the peace didn't last long, eh? The sudden rumble of a truck engine echoed from the road. He opened his eyes and saw another neighbor parking just outside the property. This one looked serious, almost too serious. The man got out of the truck with firm steps. Glancing around sharply before walking straight toward him, he felt a new wave of tension. He didn't want any more confrontations, but he also knew he couldn't control how people reacted. The man stopped a few feet away and crossed his arms. "I heard something interesting," he said. "They're saying you're the new owner." He nodded quietly. "Yes, I am." The man scoffed lightly, shaking his head. "You don't look like someone who buys property around here." There it was again. The same assumption, but this time wrapped in a different tone. He met the man's eyes calmly. "What does someone who buys property look like?" The man opened his mouth, then closed it again. He wasn't expecting that question. After a moment, the man sighed. "Look, I'm not here to fight. I just don't want outsiders coming in and changing everything." "I'm not here to change everything," he said. "Just my land." The man hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Fair enough. But this area has history. People have lived here for decades. We're protective." "I understand," he replied. "But I didn't come here to take anything from anyone." The man shifted his weight, looking less defensive now. "You really own this place? You got papers and everything?" "Yes," he said. "Everything is legal." The man looked away, then exhaled deeply. "All right then. Welcome, I guess." It wasn't warm, but it wasn't hostile either. It was progress. The man turned around and started walking back to his truck. Before getting in, he called out, "Just treat the land well." "That's all we care about." "I will," he promised. When the truck drove away, he leaned back against the bench quietly. Each interaction left a different feeling inside him. Some were heavy, some were light. Some made him think, some made him breathe easier. This place had its challenges. Not because of the land, but because of the people connected to it. He stood up again, walking slowly across the open space. He imagined building a small garden along one side, repairing the shed, painting the fence a warm color. He imagined making the place look alive again. But he also knew something else certain. The trust of the people around him wouldn't happen overnight. They had spent years building their own stories here. Now he was part of that story whether they liked it or not. As he walked along the boundary, he realized something important. The misunderstandings, the accusations, the police being called, those were just the beginning. The real challenge wasn't proving he owned the land. It was showing the neighbors who he really was. He wouldn't rush it. He wouldn't force it. He would let time do what time does best. And somewhere deep inside, he sensed that the next few days and weeks would bring more surprises, some good, some difficult, but all part of the path he had chosen. He looked over the land once more, letting the warm afternoon settle over everything. Whatever came next, he was ready. The moment the officers stepped away to talk among themselves, the whole place grew strangely quiet. It wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet, the heavy kind that comes after people realize they may have rushed into something without thinking. The group that had been so loud earlier suddenly looked unsure. Their voices, which had been sharp and bold before, now dropped to low whispers. The man who had been the most aggressive kept glancing at the officers, then at the protagonist. He was trying to figure out how everything flipped so fast. The protagonist didn't say anything. They just stood there calmly, their hands resting near the folder that held the papers which had changed the entire atmosphere. They weren't smiling, and they weren't angry either. They simply looked like someone who had known the truth from the beginning, had waited patiently for everyone else to catch up. It made the group uneasy, but it also kept the moment from becoming something more dramatic. After a minute, an officer walked back over. His tone was respectful now. He nodded, almost like greeting a colleague. "Everything checks out," he said softly. "You're the legal owner. Not just of this place, but also the surrounding land. The documents are all valid." The group standing behind him looked shocked, even though they already sensed what the answer would be. They had hoped, maybe for the final few seconds, that the situation would swing their way. But now reality was right in front of them, as clear as day. The officer's voice left no room for doubt. The protagonist only nodded slightly. They didn't act proud, and they didn't boast. They didn't have to. The papers had already spoken for them. The man who had called the police stepped forward, rubbing the back of his neck like he wasn't sure what to do with his hands. A few minutes earlier, he had been full of confidence, talking loudly, insisting that the protagonist needed to be removed. But now he looked like someone who wished he could rewind the day and start again. We didn't know, he said. His voice was softer now, almost apologetic. We just thought someone was trespassing. No one told us anything. The others nodded quickly, eager to show they weren't trying to cause trouble. One woman stepped forward, trying to sound friendly. Yes, we were just trying to protect the place. We didn't mean anything bad. It was the kind of shift that happens when people realize they were wrong but don't want to say it directly. They didn't want to look foolish. And they definitely didn't want to seem rude to someone who actually owned the land they lived on. The protagonist listened quietly. They weren't the type to rub the truth in someone's face. They just wanted the tension to settle so everyone could move on. I understand, they replied in a calm voice. But next time, before calling the police, maybe just ask. It saves a lot of trouble for everyone. The group nodded again, some of them too embarrassed to even look up. The officer who had spoken earlier cleared his throat gently. He seemed relieved that things were going smoothly. Well, everything is sorted now, he said. No issues. Just a misunderstanding. Let's all try to communicate better in the future. His tone made it clear that he wanted the residents to take the lesson seriously. Not in a harsh way, but in the kind of way that makes people think twice before jumping to conclusions. Another officer approached the protagonist and returned the papers neatly. Thank you for staying patient, he said. The protagonist nodded again, appreciating the calm tone. They placed the papers back in their folder. Those documents had been sitting quietly inside for days. But today they had spoken louder than anything else. The officers stepped away, talking briefly with each other before heading back to their vehicle. The group watched them leave, all standing very still, as if moving might draw attention. When the car finally drove off, everyone seemed to exhale at the same time. The silence that followed was thick with discomfort. The same people who had once tried to intimidate the protagonist now looked unsure of how to act. Some shuffled their feet. Some looked at the ground. Some managed awkward smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. The man who had led the confrontation forced out a small laugh. Well, this was something, he said weakly. No hard feelings, right? The protagonist could have made the moment more uncomfortable. They could have reminded him of the way he spoke earlier, or pointed out how unnecessary the call to the police had been. But they didn't. They simply nodded, giving the group room to breathe. It's fine, they said gently. Just try not to assume the worst next time. Some of the group looked relieved. Others still seemed embarrassed. But overall, the tension began to fade, leaving behind only the weight of realization. They had misunderstood everything from the beginning, and now they had no choice but to accept it. The protagonist took a slow step back, letting the moment settle. They didn't need attention, and they didn't need recognition. They just wanted to get back to what they came for. They walked a few steps toward the property again, checking the area calmly. Now without any resistance from the people who had tried so hard to stop them earlier. Behind them, the group whispered among themselves. Some were clearly trying to figure out how to avoid making the same mistake again. Others were quietly planning how they might apologize more properly later. The shift in attitude was almost immediate, but it was genuine, at least for now. The protagonist's walk around the property felt different this time. There was no tension at their back, no voices questioning their presence, no one rushing toward them aggressively. Everything was peaceful, even if the people nearby were still trying to recover from the shock. For the first time that day, the protagonist allowed themselves to breathe a little deeper. They didn't feel victorious in a loud or prideful way. Instead, they simply felt content. Content that the truth had finally settled the situation. They paused near a corner of the property, looking at the trees, the small patches of grass, the fence line. Everything seemed calmer, clearer. The ownership papers felt heavier in their hands, but in a reassuring way. It reminded them how important it was to stay steady, even when others tried to shake them, a few steps behind. One of the quieter neighbors approached slowly, keeping a polite distance. "I'm sorry about earlier," the neighbor said softly. "We really didn't know. People here get nervous easily. We shouldn't have reacted like that." The protagonist turned toward them, offering a small smile. "It happens," they replied. "No harm done." The neighbor nodded gratefully and walked back to the rest of the group. Even from a distance, it was clear that the overall mood had shifted from tension to reflection. People were talking with low voices, some shaking their heads at their own behavior, some shrugging helplessly as if trying to explain to each other what had gone wrong. The protagonist continued walking until they reached the far edge of the property. The sunlight touched the ground gently, and for a moment, everything felt peaceful again. No drama, no shouting, no accusations, just a quiet moment that they had wanted from the beginning. As they walked back toward the main path, the group watched but didn't interfere. Some offered small nods. Some managed awkward smiles. Some avoided eye contact entirely. But one thing was clear: their attitude toward the protagonist had changed completely. It wasn't fear, and it wasn't forced respect either. It was simply the understanding that they had been wrong, and now they had to adjust. The protagonist didn't hold on to bitterness. They weren't the type to stay angry. They simply believed that people made mistakes, and what mattered was how they learned from them. If this group learned to communicate better, then at least the whole mess served a purpose. As they reached their car, the protagonist took one last look at the property. It didn't look different on the outside, but the energy around it had changed. The land now felt like theirs, not just legally, but in spirit. Recognized, respected, and accepted, they placed the folder of papers on the front seat and sat for a moment, letting the whole scene replay in their mind. The confrontation, the police, the shift in tone, everything had happened so fast. But even through all of it, they had stayed calm. They gave them a quiet sense of pride. Not the loud kind, but the steady kind that stays with a person long after the moment has passed. Before starting the car, they glanced at the group one last time. They were standing together now, talking calmly, looking much different from the group that had tried to push them away earlier. For a second, the protagonist felt a small spark of hope. Maybe the next time they met, things would start on a better note. Then they drove away slowly, feeling lighter than when they arrived. The property was theirs, the truth was clear, and the misunderstanding was finally over. They didn't need anything more than that. The day had been stressful, but it had ended with clarity, and sometimes that's all a person really needs. The next morning, the sunlight came quietly through the curtains, and the protagonist woke up feeling lighter than they had the day before. There was no rush in their movements, no tightness in their chest. The tension from yesterday had melted away overnight, leaving behind only a quiet sense of relief. They took their time getting ready, knowing they would return to the property again, but this time with a completely different atmosphere waiting for them. They grabbed the same folder that had caused such a stir the previous day. It sat on the table, harmless and ordinary, yet it had changed everything. The protagonist picked it up with more care than usual, not because they needed the papers again, but because it reminded them of how easily situations can shift when the truth finally comes to the surface. Driving back toward the area, the streets looked calmer. It was a warm day, the kind that made everything feel relaxed. Even the air felt softer. When they reached the property, they noticed something immediately different: the quiet. There were no angry voices, no suspicious looks, no crowd waiting with crossed arms. Instead, a few residents were outside, going about their morning routines as if nothing unusual had happened. But the moment they saw the protagonist's car, their posture changed. Some straightened up, some smiled awkwardly, and some simply paused, unsure of what to do. It wasn't fear. It was more like the hesitant politeness people show when they know they should have acted differently the first time. The protagonist got out of the car slowly. They didn't make a big deal out of anything. They didn't walk with an attitude, and they didn't try to make their presence feel heavy. They simply moved with quiet confidence, the same way they had the first day, only now. Everyone understood why. One of the residents from the group took a hesitant step forward. It wasn't the loud man from before, or the woman who had tried to take charge. It was someone quieter, someone who had barely spoken during the confrontation. They walked up slowly, holding a tray with 2 cups of tea. "Morning," the person said gently. "Thought maybe you'd like something warm? Yesterday got a bit intense." The protagonist wasn't expecting that. They paused for a moment, then accepted the tea with a small smile. "Thank you," they said softly. "That's kind of you." The resident nodded quickly, almost relieved that the gesture was accepted. "We really didn't know who you were. We acted too fast. It wasn't right." The protagonist didn't want the person to feel uncomfortable, so they spoke with a calm tone. "It's all right. Things happen. What matters is we understand each other now." The resident let out a breath they had probably been holding since yesterday. "We'll try to do better," they said before heading back to their side of the neighborhood. The protagonist looked around the area again. It felt different, warmer, more welcoming, almost as if the land itself had settled down. They walked along the fence line, taking their time to inspect the corners, noticing things they hadn't paid attention to during all the stress of the previous day. A few minutes later, the man who had called the police finally appeared. He looked nervous at first, then gave a small nod. "Hey," he said quietly, "mind if I talk to you for a minute?" The protagonist turned toward him, keeping their expression neutral. "Sure," he answered. The man looked down at his hands before speaking. "I was out of line yesterday. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I reacted too fast. I didn't give you a chance. I shouldn't have spoken to you like that." The protagonist thought about his tone from yesterday and the way he had acted. They could have held on to the irritation or reminded him how he had tried to push them away, but instead they let it go. "It's okay," they said gently. "I understand people get protective of their community, but talking first can save a lot of trouble." The man nodded with real regret. "You're right. And now that we know you're the owner, well, we want to make sure things start fresh." He extended his hand, and the protagonist shook it without hesitation. After the handshake, the man walked away, looking lighter than when he arrived. It was clear that he had been carrying guilt from the misunderstanding. The protagonist didn't blame him anymore. Everyone makes mistakes. What mattered was that he tried to make things right. As the day went on, a few more residents approached with small gestures, a friendly smile, a wave from across the yard, or a quick apology. None of it felt forced. It felt like a group of people trying their best to rebuild something that had cracked before it even began. The protagonist continued to walk around the property, finally able to focus on the things they had originally come for. They inspected the ground, checked the trees, examined the fence, and made small notes to themselves about repairs and improvements. But this time, instead of feeling watched or judged, they felt supported or at least accepted. It was strange how quickly things could change. Yesterday, the group had stood like a wall between them and the land. Today, the same people were stepping aside, giving space, offering help, and letting things move naturally. Later in the afternoon, while the protagonist was checking a corner of the property, a child ran past, chasing a ball that had rolled into the area. The protagonist picked it up and handed it back with a warm smile. The child beamed at them. "Thank you," the child said cheerfully before running off again. Behind the child, 2 adults watched with relieved faces, probably grateful that their kid's innocent mistake didn't create another misunderstanding. They waved shyly, and the protagonist waved back. The moment felt simple, but meaningful. The walls that had been up yesterday were slowly crumbling. People weren't just tolerating their presence anymore. They were beginning to see them as part of the place. As the sun began to lower, the protagonist sat on a small stone near the fence and looked out at the land. The golden light touched everything gently. It reminded them of how peaceful life could feel once the storm had passed. They thought back on everything: the accusations, the officers, the sudden shift when the papers came out, the apologies, the awkward smiles. None of it seemed heavy anymore. It all felt like a lesson, one that everyone involved needed to learn. This situation wasn't about winning or proving anything. It was about patience, communication, and staying calm when others tried to shake you. It was about knowing the truth and letting it rise without forcing it. And most of all, it was about finding peace after conflict. When the protagonists finally stood up to leave, they felt completely at ease. They walked back to their car slowly, taking one last look around. The residents were outside again, some waving, some nodding politely, and some simply smiling for the first time. The neighborhood felt like a place that could grow into something comfortable, maybe even friendly one day. The protagonist opened the car door and placed the folder gently on the seat again. The same folder that had caused so much attention yesterday now sat quietly like it had never made a sound. They didn't need to open it today. They didn't need to prove anything anymore. As they sat behind the wheel, they took one more slow breath. This time, it felt like a clean start. They started the car, rolled down the window, and waved at a couple who were tending to their garden across the street. The couple waved back with warm smiles. Driving away, the protagonist didn't feel triumphant or superior. They felt grateful for clarity, for calmness, and for the chance to begin again with people who now understood the truth. The road ahead looked quiet and open, stretching into a peaceful evening. And for the first time since they had arrived at the property, it felt like everything was finally falling into place. Nothing dramatic, nothing loud. Just a gentle ending to a day that had started with tension, but ended with respect. And sometimes, a gentle ending is the strongest one of all.